Hello and welcome. I'm Nathaniel and I'll be presenting about IT automation today. So an overview of this presentation, there's three sections. We'll be talking about what automation is, why it should be used, and how it can be done. And there will be a couple kind of asides that I'm going to dig into, and then as you can see, we're going to be talking about tools at the end. So what is IT automation? So it includes repeatable instructions and processes as code. We're using software to create those things so that we can replace or reduce human interaction with IT systems with the goal of little to no human intervention. And this is key to IT optimization and digital transformation. Because in our modern IT environments, they need to be scalable and fast, and automation enables this. Automation also extends into specific technologies and methodologies such as DevOps and cloud, edge computing, security, and several other things. So, what can it be used for? It starts with provisioning. This is used to set up infrastructure on which we run the business systems. So these are the environments in which we collect and build software. This used to be done in hardware, but it's moving towards software, which allows templates as code, which means that a developer can define the entire environment, store that definition in version control, and then use an automated mechanism to build an environment from that template as code. So I want to talk about environments before we get any further, because it is a bit of a vague term, but it's very important to this topic. So as I alluded to earlier, an environment is a user-defined collection of resources that host the application, and it is the application's mechanism for bringing together all the components with the agent that actually deploys them. So these are the dependencies, the networking stuff, everything needed to run the application. So we have an environment defined, but it's raw, and that's where configuration management comes in, which is the definition of the behavior of the infrastructure. This is stuff like ports, file systems, and users. And it is defined by developers and ideally easy to understand by the entire IT team. And again, this is done through code, so it can be distributed and easily documented. Next, we work with orchestration. As you can see, we've been building up environments and spaces for developers to work. And as we get more and more environments in an organization, we need to automate the management of those tasks and processes across many machines. And as we increase the complexity of IT systems, we also need to increase, it's also increasingly complex to manage all the moving parts, which is what organization is used for. Application deployment has a lot to do with pipelines. So we have a single pipeline that automates the build, test, and deployment of our code. It helps move from commit and build to testing to deployment in approved, trusted, and codified manner. This also, so the whole automation process reduces risk and increases productivity by making everything a documentable, repeatable process. And this especially helps us as developers who are deploying applications, because we know that if we're working with a pipeline, the software will be deployed and tested and built the same way every time. And if there is an issue, it's likely with the code, and we can find that issue faster because we're not searching through the environment to find if there's anything wrong. Finally, we are going to be using IT automation for security and compliance. Within a pipeline, we can embed automated steps that define and enforce policies. And this is great because it allows us to standardize the processes and workflows and have them visible to the entire organization. So, why is it used? And I've talked a bit about this already, but we're going to go more into detail. As mentioned earlier, it is essential to use automation when an organization is undergoing IT optimization and digital transformation. It enables the scalability and fast deployment and redeployment of modern dynamic IT environments, extends to specific technologies and methodologies, and by consolidating code, environments, templates, processes in one place, it's easier to find them, easier to communicate about them. And in theory, this can be, well, in theory, this will help company culture and employee quality of life by providing the tools that we need to communicate better. So why should it be used? particularly with the relationship between developers and operations in the past, it helps a lot of this. It enables the on-demand self-service creation of environments. And this basically works out to convenience for dev and ops and the ability to do things sooner. Automation removes the need to configure stuff manually and allows us to produce fully featured environments in hours rather than weeks. It enhances stability and security because developers are able to observe how the app performs in a production-like environment. Helps them to test it sooner with a real data and a real load. And ops is able to respond to higher priority tasks. It reduces risk because we're able to quickly roll back objects in production to the previous version, because again, this is all in source control. So if there is something wrong with the objects in production, we can just roll everything back to the last commit in GitLab or GitHub or Mercurial, etc. And that's usually the push of a few buttons in a web GUI. And as discussed earlier, it also consolidates the knowledge of the organization. We're working with version control, which acts as a single source of truth. If there is a dispute or a question about how an environment functions, there will be one single template defined as code in a version control. And again, this increases communication and allows us to have an automated build mechanism that draws from that specific place in version control. Now, let's talk about some of the tools that can be, let's talk about some tools. There's a lot. And if this looks intimidating, don't worry. We usually only use one or maybe two from each of these 6 categories. You've probably used some in school and on co-op. And like I said, organizations tend to use 1 or 2 from each area. And if we're looking at collaboration or monitoring, it's okay to use maybe 1 or 2. A lot of people use Jira and Slack. However, in some areas, having more than one can actually decrease communications, especially if we're doing stuff like configuration management or continuous integration. If we have our deploy pipeline, being done in Jenkins and TeamCity and CircleCI, then we have 3 different pipelines, and we've kind of gone backwards in that we are using 3 different sources of, not sources of truth, but there are 3 different places that basically the same thing is happening, and that is the opposite of consolidating stuff. So let's dig in a bit more. So Jenkins is a very popular tool. I've personally used it on co-op, and some of you may as well. It's an automated pipeline solution for continuous integration, continuous deployment, development, testing, got deployment in there. It's open source, ready to run out of the box. It runs in a web GUI on most operating systems, certainly the big 3 of Windows, Mac, and Linux. And it is able to autonomously perform and monitor performance of repetitive tasks. Has hundreds of plugins. You're able to define all sorts of tasks via scripting pipelines. And there are a lot of funny little icons that people have made for it, as you can see. So Vagrant is for infrastructure automation. It enables convenient build, configuration, management, reproduction, and sharing of virtual machines. And what this does is it allows employees who are working remotely to have portable work environments. So it runs on top of virtualization solutions like VirtualBox, Hyper-V, VMware, runs on Mac, Windows, and Linux. And it also includes plugins for cloud provisioning and configuration management. Docker is becoming quite popular. It's a containerization tool which allows for the execution of discrete applications and environments on one server. And when I say discrete, I mean that they are completely separate. You can have, completely separate. There's no play between two Docker containers unless you set that up. And so we have all these containers, which allows for quick assembly of applications from components and allows for the optimization of resources and high availability. Works with any stack, and as many of you may know, it is a simplified configuration. We're not running a whole operating system. It's just a Docker image, as they're called, and it runs only the resources needed for a particular application. Chef is kind of an automated build tool. It's used for infrastructure automation, cloud automation, and environment management. I've mentioned several times infrastructure as code, and that's what Chef does. You can store a machine, you can store all the settings for a computer, server, machine, with definitions of all the applications you need on that machine as code. And that can be stored in version control. You can track changes to your definition of the machine. And this is where we can have, well, Chef is an automated build mechanism where it can call that repository with the template defined as code and deploy that onto a machine so that you can automatically not create an entire machine, but if you have a raw install, you can install everything you need on that machine. If that sounds complex, it is. It has a steep learning curve, but there is pretty good community support. And once you get up and running, it is stable and reliable for large-scale deployments. And because you can spin up an entire machine automatically from code, it enables high availability. If a machine gets trashed for whatever reason, you can have a completely new one within hours. So there's some other tools. There's many tools. Some that I probably am not familiar with that you guys might be able to point out. Kubernetes is a very popular one. It's a container orchestration tool, and for that reason, it's often used with Docker. Puppet and Ansible are also dealing with infrastructure automation and orchestration, similar to Chef, although I've only used Chef, so I'm sure Puppet and Ansible do have their own nuances. SaltStack is a configuration and orchestration tool. Monit and Snort, you can see what they do there. Again, I'm not familiar with them, but you might be. And Jira is a very popular tool. It's not a tool for doing the automation itself, as far as I know, but it is, from experience, I can say that it's a great way of orchestrating teams of people. Anyways, thank you for your time. I hope you've learned stuff that you can implement in your studies and or organization. And I hope you have a good day. Thank you. Bye.